We're going to answer as many questions as we have had previously and hopefully cover many of the ones that will be on your mind. The rest of the questions that come in will be answered by PTC and released shortly after their webinar. So to that end, we wanted to welcome all of you to the webinar about Ataluren and welcome Jay Barth, who will be leading the webinar. Jay joined PTC in 2009, has had a long history with biotech and developing drugs, and so we really want to welcome him and spend as much time as possible in Jay's presentation of Ataluren, where we are today and where we hope to be going tomorrow. And so with that, I'm going to turn over the presentation to Jay. Welcome, Jay.
All right, Beth. Thank you so much for the introduction. Just on a technical issue, I just want to make sure that I am able to advance the slides. It seemed to disappear from my screen for a moment, so if someone on your end could make sure that that's happening. I want to thank PPMD for making it possible for us to talk about our upcoming trial today. It feels as if we've been developing Ataluren for decades, but actually it was only a few years ago that the very first study of Ataluren took place, opening up a lot of possibilities in drug development in DMD. We're proud of this achievement, and it was only possible because of the dedication of patients and families, and we're committed to utilizing all of our knowledge to conduct the confirmatory study with the hope of securing the approval for Ataluren in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I want to advance to the next slide, so if you hold on 1 second, unless folks on your end can do that. Is that possible?
I just advanced it for you, Jay.
Oh, thank you. Okay. I'll just say advance when the time comes. That's far easier. Thank you. All right. The topics I'm going to cover today are in this slide, which I'll first talk about the Ataluren mechanism of action, review our Phase 2b study results, the design of the Phase 3 study, including the inclusion-exclusion criteria, trial sites, and next steps. Then I'll give a brief update on the Ataluren program current status, where you can get further information, and then I'll address questions that have been submitted already. We've received quite a few questions, more than 24 questions from our audience prior to this webinar. I've tried to incorporate as many of the answers as possible within the presentation, and questions that aren't incorporated in the presentation will be addressed at the end. But please bear in mind that we have a patient advocacy director available to answer your questions that I don't get to today, that you submit at this point. And if you don't already know Diane Getz, I invite you to get in touch with her. We have her contact information available at the end of the presentation. On the next slide, slide 2, talk a little bit about PTC Therapeutics for those that don't know us. PTC is a small biotech company in central New Jersey. It was started about 14 years ago by our CEO, Dr. Stuart Peltz, who was previously on the faculty at Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. Our most active programs are in rare genetic disorders, and Duchenne muscular dystrophy is our most advanced program. And this is due in part to our early contact with PPMD. It's really with their support and encouragement and enthusiasm that we made DMD the first indication that we've explored for Ataluren. And now we're really gratified to have a path forward with this new confirmatory study that I'll be talking about. The concept that we initially took to the clinic in 2005 is now ready to be confirmed, and we're very proud to be part of this community and working with you all. The next slide covers the mechanism of action of Ataluren. So before I talk about the trial, I think for those who have not seen and not familiar with it, it's worth spending a little time on how Ataluren works as a drug. Ataluren is a small molecule that is taken orally, and it interacts with the ribosome, which is the machine that makes proteins based on the code written in the RNA, which is depicted in this slide. It's called the messenger RNA. And a nonsense mutation, or nonsense codon, causes a premature stop in the RNA, which prevents the ribosome from making the complete protein. It only makes a partial protein, which really isn't functional, and that's the cause of the disease. in approximately 13% of the cases of DMD. What Ataluren does is interacting with the ribosome to allow it to read through the premature stop codon. The next slide, please. And make a full-length protein. So Ataluren addresses nonsense mutations. It doesn't address deletions, for example, or other types of mutations. So it's very specific for the nonsense mutation, the premature stop codon. And if you're a parent and are unsure about your son's mutation, you should discuss it with your physician or with PPMD to see if it's the type of mutation, the nonsense mutation, that is a target for treatment with Ataluren. Having reviewed the mechanism of action, I'd like to move into the phase 2b study and a summary of those results. The next slide, establishing a new path, it talks about the work that needed to be done in order to conduct the phase 2b trial. And it's really this phase 2b trial that we conducted that lays the foundation for the upcoming phase 3 confirmatory study that we're about to start. The phase 2b study was the first double-blind, placebo-controlled trial of a new chemical entity in this disorder. And in order to conduct this study, it really required that new clinical endpoints for DMD be established, because there wasn't a precedent in a study that was being conducted for registration of a new drug. This really was a critical issue that needed to be addressed in order to conduct the phase 2b study. And to do this, PTC partnered with investigators and regulators and patient groups to develop these endpoints and a trial design that in the end would be satisfactory to the regulatory authorities, because ultimately that is the goal of the studies we're conducting, to get approval of the drug from the regulators. But in order to do this, there were quite a number of challenges, one of which was relatively limited availability of natural history data. At least going back a few years, this certainly was a limitation that has since been addressed with generation of new data that's now available. But at the time that the study was started, there wasn't that much natural history data available to inform us on the trial design. The endpoints that we were working with others to establish had to be feasible and doable by multiple sites, quite a number of sites, across different countries. So we had to be able to do them on a large scale. And we also had to know that the regulators' opinion of the endpoints was favorable, that they would consider them showing a clinical benefit. So these were all factors that needed to be addressed in order to undertake the phase 2b study. But we were able to do that, as I said, working with all of these groups. And because of the willingness of the families who are living with nonsense mutation DMD to participate in the trials, we've been able not only to advance Ataluren's development, but also to help lead the way for other potential therapies for this disorder. And the 6-minute walk test, which I'll be spending some time on, is now the most common primary outcome measure as a clinical endpoint in DMD trials for us and for others who are looking for new therapies for the disorder. The next slide outlines the study design of the phase 2b study that we conducted, and some may be familiar with it, but for those that are not, to go through it briefly, it was a placebo-controlled study, double-blind study, so none of the patients in the study knew what they were receiving. And one of the treatment arms in the study was high-dose Ataluren, one was low-dose Ataluren, and one was placebo. And there were about 57 to 60 patients in each of the arms, where treatment was given for 48 weeks. And the eligibility criteria you can see on the left part of the slide, and this is just some of the key criteria, of course, required that a nonsense mutation be present, that the patients be at least 5 years old, and be able to walk at least 75 meters. And if the patient was receiving corticosteroids, that would be a stable dosing regimen. But corticosteroids were not a requirement to be in the study. And after completing the 48-week double-blind part of the study, patients were eligible to continue on Ataluren on an open-label extension study. So that is how the study looked overall. On the next slide, I'd like to address the primary endpoint, the 6-minute walk test, and how that was arrived at. We've received a lot of questions about the 6-minute walk test, and I want to make sure it's clear to everyone why it was used in this study and why it will be used in the upcoming study as well. First of all, the 6-minute walk test measures, of course, walking ability, which clearly has a very logical connection to DMD and a way of looking at the progression of the disease. And progressive loss of walking ability is certainly a very critical functional concern in this disorder. The changes in walking ability show how patients are able to function in that respect, and being able to maintain walking ability for a longer period of time would therefore represent a clinically meaningful outcome of value to patients and to families. Now, we recognize that even though the 6-minute walk test has limitations, we believe it is a tool that will allow these first generation of treatments for DMD, starting with Ataluren, to be able to demonstrate clinical utility. And that was the status of this primary endpoint at the time that we started to conduct the Phase 2b study. The next slide shows the results from the Phase 2b on the primary endpoint, the 6-minute walk test. And what we're showing here are the results of the refined analysis that was conducted post hoc that showed that boys in the low-dose Ataluren group, on average, showed a considerable difference in the distance they were able to walk when compared to those on placebo. Going into the study, we were looking for a 30-meter difference in the distance walked between one of the Ataluren groups and placebo. And what you can see in this slide is that the placebo group, in gray, over 48 weeks, if you follow that line, had a decrease at the end of the study of approximately 44 meters in the 6-minute walk distance. And a similar decline was also seen in the high-dose group, and that's in blue. In contrast, the low-dose group, in green, the line on top, on average had a decline of 12.9 meters. And therefore, in this refined analysis, we see a delta, a difference between the low-dose and placebo of 31.3 meters, which is more than 102 feet. That is the treatment effect that we had pre-specified, and that's what was shown in the study. And similar changes on this order of about 30 meters have been seen in trials of other drugs and, in fact, have been the basis for the regulatory approval for these drugs. So we knew that the results that we were seeing were in the right range of that which regulators had accepted in other trials. And therefore, we believe that these data show a significant change in the course of the disease progression in DMD. And we've learned quite a lot about the 6-minute walk test, and I will come back to that in a minute. The next slide shows another way we're looking at 6-minute walk distance, which was the time to 10% worsening of the 6-minute walk distance. In other words, what was the time it took for the trial participants to reach a distance that was 10% less than at the start of the study? And as you can see, by week 48, the placebo patients in gray had progressed. About 44% of the patients on placebo had progressed. About 48% in the high-dose group had reached that point, while only 26% of the low-dose group had done so. So this analysis indicated that patients receiving low-dose Ataluren experienced slower disease progression when compared to placebo. The next slide shows the placebo data in detail from the Phase 2b study. And in this study, the Phase 2b was groundbreaking for Ataluren and for DMD in a number of ways. One of the things that Study 07 did was to provide the largest placebo-controlled data for the natural history of DMD. In other words, the progression of the disorder as it's measured in a clinical trial. And if you look at the data from the patients who are on placebo, you can see how the disease progresses without treatment. And what we see is that walking ability actually improves, in some cases, up to about age 7. And then by advancing the slides, one can see the maturational improvements, and that's the first circle, that occurs in the younger patients that were in the study, ages 5 and 6, up till about age 7. And each of these arrows represents one patient in the study and their distance walked at the beginning of the study and at the end of the study after 48 weeks. So that's in the younger patients, 5 and 6-year-old. There's generally an increase in the walking ability. And that's because at those ages, the growth and maturation of the child seems to outpace the progress of the disorder. But at about age 7, start to observe the decline in walking ability. And one can also see that the rate of decline is quite variable between patients, that some are still stable, as the circle that's indicated stabilization, that if patients are still at a relatively high walking ability, then their walking distance will be fairly stable over the course of a year. And there's some patients who have a relatively rapid loss of walking ability. That's the third circle. And that's generally the patients who started at a low walking ability at baseline at the beginning of the study, and those were the ones that were likeliest to have a rapid decline and in some cases even lose the ability to walk during the 1-year, 48-week study. So these natural history data really allow one to identify different groups within this population and predict on the whole of how their walking ability will progress over the course of 48 weeks. And therefore, using this natural history data, we can help identify the patients that are most likely to show the treatment effects in a 1-year period. And that was very important in designing the confirmatory study. In fact, this really is the most critical question about this study, which is how can Ataluren, or for that matter any treatment, demonstrate a clinically meaningful effect in a trial that lasts 48 weeks. One way to look at that is in the next slide, slide 11, which is looking at a subgroup of patients. And these are the ones that we have, and we've just talked about, age 7 and older, who are entering the decline phase in terms of walking ability. And this is also, within that, the patients who were on steroids. And we saw that of those patients, the ones on the placebo group had a very large drop in their distance walked, about 60 meters, as opposed to 44 meters in the whole population, whereas the patients who were receiving Ataluren within this subgroup were much more stable, and leading to a larger delta, as you can see there, about 48.5 meters. That's the treatment effect seen in this group of patients. And therefore, we believe that these two factors, age and steroid use, make this group a more uniform population with less variability compared to the mix of the trial participants who ranged in age from 5 and up and who are either on or not on steroids. And this population becomes very important in the design of the confirmatory study, which I will return to. The next slide addresses the safety profile of Ataluren. And Ataluren was well tolerated in the Phase 2b study. The overall adverse event profile, and these are, in other words, the side effects that one sees during a clinical trial, showed a similar severity of adverse events for Ataluren placebo. That none of the patients discontinued or stopped in the middle of the trial because of an adverse event. And there was a similar frequency of serious adverse events for Ataluren and placebo. In fact, the most common adverse events, which were vomiting, headache, diarrhea, and there were a number of others, were really well balanced between the treatment arms. There wasn't a difference between Ataluren and placebo. And generally the adverse events, the side effects that occurred were transient, short-term in nature, and we didn't see any cumulative toxicity or cumulative side effects with continued dosing over a longer period of time. So overall, the results of this trial, which are on the next slide, showed a clinically meaningful effect on ambulation, which we measured with the 6-minute walk test. And I haven't had the chance to show you the results for secondary outcome measures, but these included time function tests, such as the 10-meter walk-run, the 4-stair climb, and 4-stair descend. And these secondary outcome measures were supportive of the primary test, the 6-minute walk test. And as I show you, the safety profile showed that Ataluren was well tolerated. So at a high level, those were the results from the phase 2b study that have led us to where we are today, which is the upcoming phase 3 confirmatory trial, which we can start looking at on the next slide, beginning with the design of the confirmatory study, which is study 20. So I may refer to it as that. As you can see, this trial looks fairly similar in design to the phase 2b study, and with some important changes, which I'll address. It's a double-blind, placebo-controlled study, of course, with the one dose of Ataluren, the effective dose, the 10-10-20 milligram per kilogram dose, compared to placebo. And again, it's a 48-week trial. In this case, the visits will occur every 8 weeks. And the randomization and stratification of the patients will be based on their age and baseline 6-minute walk distance, because we recognized, and from the information that I showed you before, that age and the baseline walking ability are important factors in predicting how the 6-minute walk distance will progress over the course of 48 weeks. The primary outcome measure remains the 6-minute walk distance, which really has become the established primary endpoint in clinical trials in DMD. And as you can see, we're planning to recruit 220 patients for the trial, 110 patients for each arm. And given what we now know about this 6-minute walk test, this is the sample size, the number of patients that's needed in order to show the effects that we are seeking for the 6-minute walk test with statistical significance. And after completing the 48-week double-blind placebo-controlled phase, patients, of course, will be able to continue on Ataluren in an open-label extension study, at least in cases where Ataluren is not yet commercially available. I talked about the changes from the phase 2b study, and the next slide indicates one of the important changes, which is the endpoints and the number of endpoints. You can see that the new trial will have fewer secondary endpoints, and therefore clinic visits will be much less involved than they were in the previous study. You'll also note that muscle biopsies are not included in the upcoming confirmatory trial. Essentially, this phase 3 study is intended to provide the data that's required for full approval of Ataluren worldwide. And the 6-minute walk test remains the primary endpoint because we and others have now accepted that as the most established primary endpoint, and it's recognized by regulatory authorities. The secondary endpoints in this phase 3 confirmatory trial will be the time function tests, quality of life measurements, North Star ambulatory assessment, and a survey of activities of daily living. So those are the similarities and differences in terms of the endpoints of the study. Another important change from the phase 2b study are the entry criteria, which generally would be similar to what was present in the phase 2b study, but in this case we're really intent on focusing on the patient population in which it's possible to best demonstrate the effect of Ataluren in a 48-week trial. And that's what I'll be reviewing now. The next slide shows the key inclusion criteria in the study. And as I mentioned earlier, what we learned from the natural history of DMD from our previous study is that the younger patients below age 7 generally improve in their ability to walk. And given that we really need to focus this study where we can best see the benefit of the drug in order to seek approval of Ataluren, if we were to include 5 or 6-year-olds in the phase 3 study, even though, of course, they would be expected to be benefiting from Ataluren, it would be difficult to determine and show that in a 48-week trial, because over that short term for these patients, if there was a positive effect, an increase in the 6-minute walk distance in these young patients, it would not be as clear if it was an Ataluren effect or just due to the natural growth and development in 5 and 6-year-olds. So therefore, as we look at each of the inclusion criteria, we believe that even though all patients with a nonsense mutation could be candidates for Ataluren as a therapy, but we really need to focus on the group of patients, and this is age 7 and above, in order to best demonstrate the effect of Ataluren in a 48-week trial. As you can see in the second bullet, there's an upper age limit as well, which is participants must be no more than 16 years of age at the start of the study. And here we're looking for the boys who are still ambulatory at that age, but who are finding walking difficult. There's a requirement that the onset of characteristics, as we move through each of the bullets, and this is a build slide, that the onset of characteristics of clinical symptoms or signs has to occur by 6 years of age, which is younger than in the phase 2b study. An elevated CK is required, and, as I mentioned, ongoing difficulty with walking. In this study, steroid use is a requirement for all patients, and that's for the reasons that I described before, in order to have a more uniform population and less variable results for the 6-minute walk test in order to best demonstrate the effect of the drug. But the steroid use can be a number of different regimens. It can vary from every day to every other day, or 10 days on, 10 days off for weekend use, as long as whatever regimen it is that the participant in the study is on remains stable for the duration of the study. In this case, in this upcoming study, the minimum 6-minute walk distance at screening has to be at least 150 meters, higher than the 75 meters that was in the phase 2b study. And other detailed criteria for inclusion into the study will be explained at the trial site. The next slide, which shows 6 bullets on the exclusion criteria. If any of these are present, would exclude the patient from the trial, make the patient ineligible for the trial. And you can see that several of these criteria refer to the start of study treatment. And treatment is expected to start approximately 2 weeks after the initial screening visit, which could itself be several weeks after the informed consent is signed. We expect that enrollment of the 220 patients will take until sometime in mid-2014. So this timeline should be kept in mind when considering participating in this study. You can see the bullet on steroid therapy, that any change in steroid therapy could include the change in the type of the drug or the dose change, not related to a body weight change or difference in the schedule of the study, of the steroid, And one of the other exclusion criteria that I want to note, which is the second bullet, is prior use of Ataluren. And that means that the boys who were in our previous Ataluren studies are not eligible for this study, but keep in mind that they can remain in our currently ongoing extension studies regardless of their ambulatory status. So the access to Ataluren for boys who were in previous Ataluren studies is via the currently ongoing open-label studies. For the upcoming study, the eligibility requires that patients not have been treated previously with Ataluren. The next slide talks about, on a level for the patients and families, what does participation in this study entail? And patients who are interested in having, and parents who are interested in having their sons participate in the trial should contact the trial site of their choice, which is usually one closest to them, to ask about it. And I'll have more information about how to do this later in the presentation. of course, the beginning of any trial begins with informed consent. And that's followed by the screening visit, where it's determined whether the potential participant in the trial meets the study criteria, the inclusion and exclusion criteria. After that, assuming the participant passes successfully through the screening phase and is able to receive treatment, there's a random assignment to whether the participant receives Ataluren or placebo, which is, of course, given 3 times a day. Now, the assignment to whether patient receives drug, Ataluren or placebo, is done using a computer program. So neither the patient or family or the study investigators or anybody on the site staff, not even PTC Therapeutics personnel, have anything to do with choosing the group that the patient is in, and will not know which treatment the participant is receiving during the study. That's only known to anyone after the study is over. You can see after the random assignment to Ataluren or placebo occurs, then the dosage of the drug is determined based on body weight, and the treatment, either Ataluren or placebo, is taken 3 times a day, in the morning, midday, and evening, for 48 weeks in all, and it's supplied, both the Ataluren and placebo, as vanilla-flavored granules, and those are mixed with water, milk, or certain foods. The foods could be yogurt, pudding, applesauce. And the milk, it's not one type. It could be several types: skim milk, 1%, 2%, lactose-free. So there's a variety of choices. And, we found in all the studies we've conducted so far that the patients have really been able to take the drug very well on a consistent basis. Then patients will continue to have clinic visits every 8 weeks for the 48 weeks. And at each of these clinic visits, the 6-minute walk test will be done and other tests as part of the secondary endpoints. And the patients and or their parents will be asked about any changes they've noticed in their quality of life. And activities of daily living will be collected through a survey. The next slide, continuation, what does participation entail, indicates that reasonable expenses related to clinic visits will be reimbursed, and that the guidelines for that will be supplied by the sites. And I want to point out, this is the second bullet on the slide, that after successfully completing this study, participants who are in countries where Ataluren is not commercially available at that time can enter the extension study where they will all receive Ataluren. If Ataluren becomes commercially available during the course of the extension study, then patients will be transitioned to the commercial supply. We will have general information about the trial available on our website and also, of course, on www.clinicaltrials.gov. And as each trial site is open, we'll be adding the contact information to the listing, and that's how you'll know which sites are open, where they're located, and how to contact the sites. And you'll be able to contact the sites directly to ask about participating in the study. In terms of the trial sites, and this is covered on the next slide, as noted, the Phase 2b study was conducted at 37 sites in 11 countries on 4 continents, so it's quite a global study on a large scale. And we're certainly reaching out as potential sites for the Phase 3 study, those sites that were in the Phase 2b study, but also because of the number of patients that are needed in the study, 220 patients, we're including several new countries and continents. So there'll be additional sites in this confirmatory study as compared to the Phase 2b study. And we choose these sites very carefully based on a few factors, including how many nonsense mutation patients are seen at that site. The level of experience of the principal investigator is certainly an important factor, and how interested that institution is being a site in our studies. So right now we are working on with the potential sites, as I said, including sites that were in the Phase 2b study as well as new sites in additional countries. And we'll be finalizing that list. And when we do, which will be over the next several months, all of the sites, as I said, will be eventually listed on clinicaltrials.gov. So right now we hope to enroll our first patient to the study by the end of this quarter, and we expect that full enrollment, as I mentioned, will be completed by mid-2014. The next slide is talking about the update for the current ongoing Ataluren studies. There are two studies right now, open-label studies, for patients who were in our previous Ataluren studies, one in the U.S. and one in other countries outside the U.S. In the U.S. study, which has 14 sites in it, 107 patients have been enrolled to date. We are collecting only safety data, and there have been no new safety findings identified in the study, which is very reassuring. In the study in other countries, EU, Israel, Australia, and Canada, this study is currently ongoing in terms of its enrollment. First sites have been activated, and about 40 patients have been enrolled to date, with the potential for 96 patients to enroll based on those patients who had been in previous Ataluren studies. In this study, we're collecting safety and efficacy data as well, but because we haven't completed the enrollment, it's really too early to have any data on efficacy. But as in the U.S. study, Ataluren, we see, continues to be well tolerated by the patients in this ongoing study. The next slide is an update on the regulatory path for Ataluren. And PTC has been very actively engaged with the U.S. and the EU regulatory agencies in very extensive discussions about the Ataluren clinical program. The FDA has given us feedback on the confirmatory study design and has also told us that the confirmatory study, when combined with the phase 2b study, should be the basis of a U.S. approval. The European Medicines Agency, EMA, has a mechanism that's not available to the FDA, which is called conditional approval. And we submitted an application for conditional approval of Ataluren based on the phase 2b study. And that application is under review at this time. This conditional approval requires a conduct of a confirmatory study. And therefore, the one phase 3 confirmatory study that is about to start is meant to satisfy both the FDA and EMA. And that's why positive results from this study would serve as a basis for full approval both in the U.S. and the EU. As I said, the EMA, and it's their Committee for Human Medicinal Products, or CHMP, is currently reviewing our application for approval of Ataluren. And if Ataluren were to be granted conditional approval, it could happen before the end of 2013, this year. The next slide are ways to get more information about the upcoming phase 3 study. One is through clinicaltrials.gov, as I mentioned. Once the study is open, that's where detailed information about the study will be available. You can sign up for Ataluren updates at www.ptcbio.com under Contact Us. And you can certainly address any questions to Diane Getz, our Director of Patient and Professional Advocacy, at the email that's indicated on the slide. So we have many ways for you to get information, and we encourage you to take advantage of that in order to become more informed about the phase 3 confirmatory study. So the next to last slide is a thanks. It has been quite an effort on a number of people's parts to get to the stage we're at now, where we can get to this phase 3 confirmatory study. Particularly want to thank the patients and families who've participated in our studies. They've really been very dedicated to all the work that has been done on Ataluren to date. And of course, the many investigators and physical therapists and other clinical site staff who've made great contributions to the development of Ataluren. And I'd also like to extend the PTC's appreciation to the groups and patient advocates that have really provided very critical organizational and financial support to help bring this new science and new hope for patients with Duchenne and Becker muscular dystrophy. So with that, I'll conclude the presentation, and I believe, Pat, you have some questions for me, and I'd be glad to address them.
I do, Jay. First of all, I want to thank you for the excellent presentation. I think it was very clear, and I learned a lot, and I'm certain our audience learned a lot as well. I also wanted to express my appreciation to PTC. I know that you've shared widely the lessons learned on the 6-minute walk test, as well as shared widely your placebo data. And to really move the field forward, we're really all deeply grateful to that effort. So with that, I want to begin some of the questions. And one of the questions is about biopsies. There's a lot of curiosity because the boys were biopsied in the earlier studies, and we are all wondering, what are the results of the biopsies from the phase 2B trial, and will those results ever be published?
Great. Thanks for the question. We are in the process of publishing the results of the phase 2B study in the scientific journal. So those will be available as soon as that is issued. And we continue to be committed to sharing our data on Ataluren through scientific publications and presentations to help not just with Ataluren, but just knowledge in general of DMD drug development that I think can benefit the entire community. Specifically with regard to the biopsies in the phase 2B study, as we've presented in scientific meetings, we were not able to reliably measure the effect on dystrophin. So we don't plan to include biopsies in the upcoming study of Ataluren. To remind everyone, in the phase 2A study, which I didn't address in the presentation, but it preceded the phase 2B study, that was a smaller study that was conducted at 3 clinical sites. In that phase 2A study, we saw an effect on dystrophin expression, which demonstrated proof of concept for Ataluren. Then we ran the phase 2B trial, which was really the first long-term multinational study with a large number of sites in which it was attempted to evaluate muscle biopsies for dystrophin, and with the goal of trying to correlating protein levels, dystrophin levels, with clinical efficacy outcomes. And we were not able to establish this correlation in the phase 2B study. We believe that the available techniques for measuring dystrophin expression at this point aren't sensitive enough to establish that correlation with clinical outcomes. And I would note that both the FDA and EMA, so that's the U.S. and European regulatory authorities with whom we've had multiple discussions, are really looking for our results to demonstrate a clinical benefit, which is why the 6-minute walk test is so important. And that's why the 6-minute walk test is the primary outcome measure in our confirmatory phase 3 study.
Thanks, Jay. That's very helpful. Another question, and I know that many people have submitted questions, and keep in mind we're going to take those in-house, and PTC will be answering those formally following the presentation. So another question is what is the expected effect of Ataluren? So are we thinking about Ataluren as a treatment, or could potentially we look at it as a cure? So a treatment in the definition of delaying progression, or a cure being much more than that?
I think if you think about cure as something that really removes the disease completely, the way you can be cured from a bacterial infection with antibiotics, in that sense, we would say Ataluren is not really a potential cure for DMD. At this point, it's an investigational new drug that, if approved, would be dosed as chronic therapy. It's really a lifelong treatment. We believe that delaying the progression of DMD would be very meaningful to patients and families and to the community as a whole. And it's this delay of disease progression that we observed in the phase 2B trial that we hope to confirm in the phase 3 trial to the satisfaction of the regulatory authorities. Now, it may take years to see the full potential for Ataluren's impact on DMD, but at this point, what we know about the drug is that it's well tolerated and targets the underlying cause of the disease. And in the trials we've conducted to date, clearly has an impact on the course of the disease. And therefore, we believe that this is a significant milestone in the development of potential therapies for DMD.
Yes, I think we all agree with you on that one. Thank you, Jay. Is Ataluren available commercially, and can it be available to anyone outside of the clinical trial?
At this stage, it's not available commercially, so it's currently available only through the clinical trials that we're conducting.
Thank you. So, Jay, some of the questions that we have listed by some of the people on the call were really to do with my son has a deletion of this or that exon. And so, as Duchenne is a rare disease and this is really only a treatment for about 13% with a nonsense mutation, why is a study this large still required?
Thanks for reminding everyone, we are focused on the patients with nonsense mutations, and that is about 13% of the DMD population as a whole. But the design of the phase 2b study, that's the study we already conducted, we hoped at that point that it would be the basis for the approval of Ataluren in the U.S. What we learned from our discussions with the FDA is that we really need to demonstrate with clear statistical significance that of Ataluren's clinical benefit compared to placebo. And the endpoint, the test, as I had described in the presentation, to measure this benefit is the 6-minute walk test. In the case of the 6-minute walk test, really it's the size of the study is most determined by how much better Ataluren performs compared to placebo, and also depends on the variability of this measurement. And because of what we learned from our phase 2b study about the 6-minute walk test, we now know that you do need a lot of patients to demonstrate with statistical significance that's meaningful for patients in the 6-minute walk test for Ataluren compared to placebo. And based on the calculations from the data we have from the phase 2b study, we now know that the phase 3 study needs over 100 patients in each arm to be able to show that both there's a difference of at least 30 meters between Ataluren and placebo, and that result will be statistically significant. So I think we now understand a lot more about the 6-minute walk test based on the phase 2b study, and that really is the determining factor in the sample size, which may seem large, but it's really the sample size that's required in order to accomplish what we are setting out to accomplish in the phase 3 study.
Thank you. Say, are Becker patients, would they have the ability to participate in the trial?
The eligibility criteria for the trial is based on the severity of the disease, so not specifically on the diagnosis of Duchenne or Becker. Potential participants, as I talked a bit about the eligibility criteria, and these are assessed during the screening period, patients must show the evidence of the disease based on characteristic symptoms or signs, and this are things such as muscle weakness, changes in gait, Cowers maneuver, and that these were present by age 6, documented in the medical records. In addition, the potential participants have to have elevated CK or creatine kinase levels in the blood and have ongoing difficulty with walking. And as I mentioned earlier, because the purpose of this trial is to provide the confirmatory data on Ataluren's benefit, we really have to focus the study in the population where we can best measure that benefit in a 48-week trial. But ultimately, the decision whether a patient is appropriate for the study is made by the investigator at the study site, because that's the person who's best able to weigh potential risks and potential benefits for each of the participants.
Thank you. So, Jay, if PTC was granted conditional approval in Europe, would patients be able to go to Europe, for instance, and purchase the drug rather than participate in the multi-site trial?
Glad you asked that. The multi-site trial is about to start, so enrollment will begin shortly, and I'd like to go over the timelines for potential conditional approval, because I think that will answer your question. As I said, the conditional approval application that we submitted is under review, but that process only began recently. We submitted the application in October of 2012, just a couple of months ago. We received validation in November, and validation means that our submission was considered complete and that the review process could begin, and that happened in November. And this review process usually requires about a year and a half to complete. Now, if we're granted, there would still be several steps in each of the countries before Ataluren could be commercially available. So conditional approval in Europe doesn't mean that Ataluren could be easily obtained by patients in other regions either. So we strongly encourage eligible patients to consider participation in the confirmatory study because that will be started, as I said, very shortly, enrollment into that study, whereas availability commercially is going to take a longer time. And we're hopeful that for the conditional approval, but very committed to completing the confirmatory study. So we certainly encourage eligible patients to participate in the confirmatory trial.
Yeah, and I think thankfully we have a certainly very well-connected community, and we can help you with across the board with encouraging people to recruit for the study and to consider enrolling their children should they fit the inclusion criteria. Jay, last question for today is, if Ataluren shows benefit in phase 3, how long before it would be commercially available? So if you were suggesting to us that recruitment should be fulfilled in 14, and then the last person out of that trial would be 48 weeks later. So when do you see, if all things line up properly, when would Ataluren be commercially available?
To talk about the confirmatory study first, and then I'll go over the timelines in a little more detail about commercial availability. In terms of the confirmatory study, we've had quite good experience enrolling and conducting, a global trial based on our phase 2b study. And fortunately, other issues that could slow the development availability don't appear to be an issue with Ataluren. Manufacturing has not been an issue. From a safety perspective, Ataluren has been well tolerated in the trials we've conducted to date. We also, as I mentioned, have support from the regulatory agencies, and that's the FDA and the European agencies for our clinical trial design. And we have the experience that hopefully will allow us to confirm the effects of Ataluren in the phase 3 confirmatory trial and achieve statistical significance. And to address the timelines, we estimate that if the first patient is enrolled by the end of this first quarter of 2013, the 220 patients would be completely enrolled by the middle of 2014. And this is an enrollment period of 15 months. Now, that may seem like a long time, but each site has to go through a list of specific procedures before they can initiate and enroll patients, and that could take several months for each site. So based on this estimated schedule for U.S. patients, we target the earliest approval for Ataluren in the U.S. in 2016. Now, it may seem like a long time, but I can assure you, for everyone here who's working on Ataluren every day, we just have to take into account that this is the first drug in DMD to go through this regulatory process, and it's really setting a new path, which, as you can understand, is pretty challenging. Now, we should also point out that the conditional approval that I mentioned in Europe could be as early as late 2013 this year or early 2014. But for the U.S., we're going to keep interacting with the FDA to determine whether in any way we can accelerate the process in the U.S. So those are the timelines for availability, and we want to make sure everyone understood that we're doing everything we can in order to speed up the process as much as possible.
Thank you, Jay. Jay and everyone listening, there are any number of questions that you've asked with regard to who can be included, what age the boys are in terms of are little boys able to be included in the inclusion criteria, and also about the process in Europe about conditional approval, as well as other issues to include labeling. We will collect all of these questions and submit them to PTC, and within a very short period of time, PTC will respond and we will post those questions. I'm sorry that we can't answer all the questions online, but some of them are really required more than Dr. Barth to respond. So we really want to provide accurate and informed answers to your questions, and we will do so. So with that, I wanted to thank you all for participating in the conference. Jay and the group at PTC, this was a really wonderful and very clear presentation, and we so appreciate all you're doing, and we wish you Godspeed, and we'll look forward to your answers to the following questions as we submit them today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Pat.